Hi everybody. It's 18 minutes after, and we do have some people that are live streaming this. This is one of the sessions that's live streamed, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us this morning in cross-disorder research efforts. You know, I know that this is a meeting for families with Phelan-McDermid syndrome, but you guys not only are your own family, you are part of a bigger family of individuals or families that have rare genetic disorders, and they may not involve SHANK3, but they involve other areas of the genome, which Tess talked about, that share similarities to families with PMS. So we wanted to talk about, or have a session today that talked about how all of those ideas are being brought together. So we're working as a unit, not just as independent organizations. So I couldn't imagine a better person to give this talk than our speaker. Many of you already know her. Her name is Dr. Audrey Thurm. She is the director of the Neurodevelopmental and Behavioral Phenotyping Service at the Intramural Program at the National Institutes of Mental Health. And many of you may know her because she was one of the original clinicians who was actually seeing families with Phelan-McDermid syndrome and working with geneticists and imaging people, and she still does work with molecular biologists and other scientists to help understand Phelan-McDermid syndrome. So she specializes in neurodevelopmental disorders, including intellectual disability and autism. She has an extensive training and career spanning over 2 decades at the NIMH. She's led initiatives like the Phelan-McDermid Syndrome Natural History Study, and she is a member of the Scientific Advisory Committee of PMSF. Of importance for this presentation, her work, though, goes beyond just Phelan-McDermid syndrome. She helps families with a number of rare genetic disorders. And she is also a scientific advisor on a program that she's going to mention called Agenda, which is an alliance it's called the Alliance of the Genetic Etiologies of Neurodevelopmental Disorders and Autism. For those of you who participated in that GI survey, that was one of the activities of Agenda, was to understand GI problems across the rare genetic syndromes. Today, she's going to share insights from her work on cross-disorder research efforts, emphasizing collaboration and the collaborative achievements that enhance the understanding of not just Phelan-McDermid syndrome, but how it fits in with the bigger picture of rare genetic syndromes and neurodevelopmental disorders. So thank you, Dr. Thurm.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for hanging in on this Saturday morning and sticking up for this one. And thank you so much to Alicia, who really, I couldn't be giving this talk without the incredible amount of work that she has done to help us launch Agenda, which I'm going to mention, and just support so much of this research. So I'm going to start, in case you do fall asleep, with my take-homes and also the outline of the talk, or the things I'm going to try to get across. And this talk is really just a commercial, or a bunch of commercials for different things that are happening outside of the Phelan-McDermid Syndrome Foundation. And, you know, I'll start by just acknowledging Kate, who I might cry on the stage, but I am so grateful for everything she's done. And she has actually brought a lot of these connections to the foundation and outside already. But I think we'll just think about this as a transitional point where I do think, especially because of the excitement going on with drug discovery and development and trials that are now happening, my message is that it's not going to happen with this foundation alone. It must happen by grouping together with other conditions. And hopefully I'll get that message across. But this needs to happen even in terms of understanding Phelan-McDermid syndrome. It has to happen in the context of other conditions because we only have a certain amount of measures, and we only have a certain number of people who can help us develop and use those measures. And so we just have to work across the conditions, and that helps us understand Phelan-McDermid better. There are many efforts now to maximize the success. And then I'm going to show you some examples, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about registries and natural history studies, and I'm going to really focus on outcome measures because that's what I do, but also because if we're going to get to the finish line with these treatment trials and FDA approval and drugs and treatments that are focused on Phelan-McDermid syndrome, we absolutely have to know what we're measuring as the outcomes, and we have to be very specific about how we do that, and the measures have to work, or else we're never going to know how the treatments work. But I will end and keep saying that more efforts are needed, so hopefully this conference is invigorating folks to keep doing that. So Alicia mentioned what I do, but I work within the NIH Clinical Center, which 90% of NIH research goes to universities around the country and world, but 10% of the work happens at NIH, and I do work within that system, but then I also work very much with people across the country and world. And what we try to do is test children with neurodevelopmental testing to be looking for characterization. We're calling it deep phenotyping, but the problem is we can't necessarily get so deep if we don't have the measures that allow us to do that. And obviously phenotype, genotype correlations, both across different conditions. So what might be specific to Phelan-McDermid syndrome, from Down syndrome, from Williams syndrome, to many other conditions. But we also really, and especially in PMS, want to be looking within the genotypes, now variants and different kinds of variants, and obviously deletion size and how that differs. So we want measures that are helpful in looking across kids and age spans, but also within. And those measures are not always the same. I'll just tell you that we need to have different measures for those different things. This figure illustrates how at the same time we're using the measures that we have we're also, as you can see across, doing evaluation of these measures, and then also trying to develop new measures as we can, sometimes for specific conditions, but hopefully across, because we're gonna get a better bang for our buck if we have it across. And then most importantly at the bottom is that we're also trying to make these measures and evaluations clinically helpful in the here and now. I just heard people talking about Medicaid. We're trying to help the evaluations and the tests and the reports that we do in the here and now for IEPs, for Medicaid, for whatever services families need. So just a few background slides in case it is hard to keep up awareness of this, but my slide on the left is from, I think, 2015, where we were at 700 genes identified related to intellectual disability, maybe autism, maybe not, but NDD, ID is the broader theme, and now we're at 1,000. I saw a figure of 1,300 recently. We're at 1,000. Meaning there are 1,000 of these, and some of them are bigger than Phelan-McDermid syndrome, Down syndrome, Williams syndrome, Fragile X. Some of them are literally two moms on a Facebook page, your kid has this, my kid has this, what do we do next, right? Or dads, or siblings, but it's, I work in the Undiagnosed Disease Program, which is funded by NIH, and the entire point of that program is to continue to identify new genes. And sometimes they find a kid has something that's already known, but often, especially where we are with genetic discovery, is that we're able to do functional studies and figure out that this might be, pathogenic as a new gene. So I sit somewhere where I want to help this foundation so badly, but I also want to make sure that we're not ignoring those families where it's a new gene. And I think the last thing any of us want to do is have that family or those families start from scratch, be searching the web for what to do, and not have a pathway or a roadmap for where to go. So my ultimate goal is to develop that, but I don't have that right now. And this slide just emphasizes, if you look at, you can call it autism, you can call it ID. This has schizophrenia and epilepsy too, but just the NDD space, kids with neurodevelopmental disabilities. I just like how this shows that the circle of idiopathic, what was unidentified, those circles are getting smaller, and the circles of those identified are getting bigger. And that means we have to shift how we think of everything. It means that autism and ID sort of space has to shift what they're doing. But it means that all these little circles, and Shank 3 is there, needs to work together, because if not, it's just a bunch of different circles. I think I'm getting that point. This is just like my favorite slide, because I read this paper in 2007 because I was already big into behavioral phenotyping then. But this was the field of behavioral phenotyping in 2007, and they thought, wow, we've exploded. So behavioral phenotyping is this idea within intellectual disability that there are genetic conditions, and the ones on here is just so fascinating because, and I'm a little scared with the geneticists in the room, but I think they will agree that the ones on here are actually conditions that could be identified before or without the genes even, being involved, because they all had very overt dysmorphic features, and we knew enough because they were common enough, or at least most of them, to know something about them. So the genetics was incredibly helpful, but then it led to what I just showed you before, and now we are just ballooning. And so I did search right before this talk, and first it said that there were only 367 papers for Phelan-McDermid syndrome, which seems small. So then I put PubMed Shank 3, and you added 851. So I think that's probably a minimum, but too much for any of us to read, which is, again, why we need things to help us. So this is a slide, thanks to Alicia and Agenda, that shows where we are with drug development for some of these, and PMS is right there. And even though there's only two, it kind of shows that it might have skipped, but it shows that we already heard about the phase 2 trial with Neuron, and now the phase 1 approaching with Jaguar. We are in it, but I do want to show that there's bigger dots for some of the other conditions, and I think that's really the point here, is that they are more than happy to share, and we need to share back and forth with them about mistakes, wins, the process, how to not maybe hit a crossroads with the FDA by saying something that will hurt the other condition in what they're doing with the process. And really just use the same language for all of this. It's exciting times. And this list is actually, I think, longer. It's definitely longer because these are just exemplars, yeah. The other day it came up about gene therapies. I am not going to talk about any of these because I don't know, but I did just want to show that you can easily find on the web that what gene therapies are FDA approved. And I think the main point is that none of them are for anything close to Phelan-McDermid syndrome, which means that we have the work to do. And I know there are lots of other trials going on for related conditions, and I just put in bold here the two that maybe are the most helpful because they, I think, are focused on kids, and neurodevelopment is definitely part of them. But keeping abreast of where things are, where any drug approvals are for neurodevelopmental conditions, I think is really important to keep up. So this is from a paper that was recently published just about what needs to be done to get, especially not just to drug approvals for symptom affecting medications or treatments, but for mechanistic modifying treatments that are in the gene therapy realm, and just the whole process for this. And I'm just, again, going to hone in here on what they call endpoint selection, which is not just, it's certainly the biomarkers, but it's really about how long someone would need to be in a trial and what the measures would be to use as that actual endpoint of what we know and what would be, a favorable risk-benefit ratio, what would be success. So I just find this schema helpful in thinking about it. And so this is the part that I'm really going to focus on. And then I searched a long time for the best slide to show about the broader drug development pathway, because you don't want to be too pessimistic, but you also need to say reality. there's this term of the valley of death. There's this other, idea. You can see here the filtering that for whatever condition, there's many, many compounds or many, many ideas. A lot of them don't go past that preclinical animal study phase, but some of them do. And then the hard part, which we are so lucky to be at now with clinical trials. And I know people talk about these phase 1, 2, 3. I'm not going to get into the details of them, but they are different phases that, as you see, you need phase 3. You need what we would call a pivotal trial to be able to get to actual drug approval. Sometimes for rare diseases you can skip, or you don't need as many participants as you would, or controls, or all these different kinds of things. And don't pay attention to those years, but do know that it's not short, to get there. And again, it is for this reason that I think the messages will continue to be work together, work with the FDA directly, which the foundation already has been very much so, and keep the whole end game in mind. So this is just part of what they call the roadmap for patient-focused outcome measurement. Several years ago, the FDA came to realize, and a law was passed, that there must be patient focus to their entire process, and it's called the Patient-Focused Drug Development Act, or program that was established, that everything about the process that I just showed needs to be patient-focused, and I will say patient and family and caregiver-focused in this case. And so this is now a piece just about that outcome measure development that is focused on using this patient-focused program. And as you can see here, the thing that I'm going to really hone in on here is what they really, really, really care about. And that is these outcomes being either survival, and we're not going to talk about that so much, but talking about how the patient feels, and that is symptoms. And I'm going to talk about what that means when your outcome is neurodevelopment, because it doesn't mean necessarily that you hurt less or your tumor's smaller and you feel less. It means something different. But the functioning one, I think we can all rally around and know what that means. So that's the one that I think we're able to really leverage a lot as we're thinking about outcomes for neurodevelopmental conditions. But we're not going to ignore the feels and survives. But I'm certainly going to focus on the functions because I think we know what that means. All right, and then they went further in developing a schema for how you would develop what they call fit-for-purpose outcome measures. And I'm just going to grab my phone so you have the time. Okay. And in that, you can see, and again, the idea is just to have these available, and I put every website I could on here so that people can go back to them. But the first thing it says is, in understanding the disease condition, is patient caregiver perspectives at natural history of the disease or condition. We're doing that, but we got to keep doing that together and iteratively figure out what the subpopulations are. We are definitely working on that, especially with genetics, if there really are subpopulations that we need to think about differently for treatment. What's the healthcare environment? Where are these kids going after we do the mechanism modifying treatment? They are still in the school system, we hope, and they're still in their therapies, and how do we fit that in with the treatments? So we need to include even people from schools and services in this process. And then really importantly, identifying what is the concept of interest. What is the concept that we all, as the stakeholders, care about for this condition? I think we can establish that it is neurodevelopment. That is a big one, maybe definitely not the only one, but a big one. And I'll get into what we mean by that, but communication, cognition, daily living skills, growing in neurodevelopment. But these are the FDA, this is their lingo. So I didn't really know what they meant by concept either, but that's what they mean. And again, it's how the patient feels, functions, survives, just trying to get us in this lingo. And then what is the context of use of the clinical trial? In this case, well, there are different, and I think that's the point, is that for a drug like Neuron is talking about, which would be ongoing, that's very different from a one-time gene therapy. And then how do we select outcome measures that are appropriate for that particular context, for that drug and trial? And I'm going to just get a little bit into this idea that they're either considered patient-reported outcomes, which is just off the table here because that is literally the patients, and it needs to be the whole population. It can't be just part of it, reporting them themselves. Observer-reported, which would be a parent or a parent usually, or a caregiver or a teacher reporting it. Clinician-reported outcomes, which would be physicians or clinicians part of it. And then performance-reported outcomes, which is the person actually performing something themselves. Either walking in a 6-minute walking test or doing an IQ test or grip strength or something like that. And so this is what they talk about, that we either need to, and they really like us to just use existing clinical outcome assessments when possible. So, things that are off the shelf, things that have been used in those other successful trials. That is their win-win. It's all about precedence, right? And justifying it, that if it's been used in a similar condition with success, that's a good win. We have problems with that because this population is heterogeneous, and also impairments are, severe so that we may not be able to use those measures. Then they talk about just modifying those. The problem is when you modify an outcome assessment, you can't just modify it and say, here it is. You need to validate it. And that's actually a lot of the work that we're doing in the natural history study. And so bear with us, those participants in the study that have seen us try things and then stop things and then try other things. That's what we're doing. We're trying to get the validation through the natural history study of these measures and realizing what's not working and pivoting when we see that. And then last but not least of the choice, and it is definitely my least favorite, is developing a new measure, because there is a lot of work that needs to be done just to develop that measure, just to understand the items. We need to do the qualitative work of asking questions. And I know some of you in this room have been doing surveys and interviews with people about this, and it is so precious and important to do that work, and we are so grateful. But we need to do that work and then figure out the psychometrics of a measure, figure out how, if it changes over 2 weeks or not, and then figure out, we hope it will change over a year or however long we need to do it, and look at it longitudinally. So the work is not short to do that. And then, as I said, we need to make sure that whatever measure we're using is specific to that trial. So if the trial is 3 months, we're probably going to need to use different measures than if the trial is 7 years, which a gene therapy trial would be. So this is my favorite slide, maybe not yours, but as a developmental psychologist, this is where we struggle with the FDA and with everything. I sort of mentioned this already, but the typical paradigm, we take aspirin for our headaches. We, get chemotherapy for our cancer, hope not. We take antidepressants for our depression. And in all of those paradigms, there's something wrong that we're trying to get rid of. And that is what the FDA did for the first, I don't know however many years they were going. That's most of chronic illness, acute illness, infectious disease, so much of what they did. But this idea that the outcome of our trial, that what we're looking for is growth and development, just doesn't fit with their models. And it doesn't fit with the measures. And it's a whole new paradigm. And it is for this reason that it's just going to be impossible if all these conditions don't group together. Because this is the message that we need to get over and over and over again to the FDA, that the paradigm is different. The length of time needs to be different. If you have a gene therapy trial, we can't expect nonverbal to sentences in a week. Maybe we'll get there, but we can't expect it. And so we need to think about the time frame, and we need to think about exactly those different arrows, because, the arrow that we fear and that some of people have certainly experienced is that loss. And if what we're trying to do is at least move that arrow to plateau and not loss, but what we certainly are hoping to do is move that arrow all the way to the pink range, which is typical development. And that's like hard because all of us who've been developing what we would think of as typically are staying in this not actually small band where we learn some skills, we take time, we keep learning, but we're in this based on what we think of as normal trajectory. So bumping up is going to be a huge, huge, huge feat, and it's what we're aiming for, but we need to think about it contextually and what with the time we need and with the measures that we need. It's to create function. It's not to maintain function that wasn't there, it's to create new function. Okay, so this is just my playing around because I'm trying to understand how rare is rare. So we're definitely not talking about common disease, but just because these are numbers, and this is in the US, and Europe, just like inches and miles and things, have different metrics for this. But these are the metrics that I could find. And then this is where we are, because I know some people were worried, is Phelan-McDermid not going to be rare anymore? I think we're good. But I'm not. It's the last thing I'm worried about, because we want to keep on getting more awareness. But right now, it's still very much in that rare space. But we don't actually know what the numbers are, as we know, because we need to get more genetic testing to know that. But it just helped me think about it. And again, back to what I talked about in the beginning, that we want to be thinking about. We're not thinking about the common, although autism is in the common at this point, but we're thinking about all the different conditions, like I said, the first one, and then many others that are much more been studied for longer, but are still in that rare space. Okay, and then this is just, I also wanted to I'm starting to point out some different agencies and places that are promoting all this work, and so NIH, anyone can ask me later about the organization, but it has 27 institutes, and then it also has centers. And about 10 years ago, a center was developed just for the purpose, actually, of rare diseases, of how difficult it is to get from that bench work where we're looking at, models and cells to the treatments. And so NCATS is a portion of NIH that was developed for this reason. And they keep on having different art contests to try to get to the message that rare diseases together are actually not rare, and another reason for banding together, because it's just too much when they're all separate. But I just thought this was fun and wanted to show that. And they're the ones who put together the Rare Disease Day, which now is international, where again a lot of these efforts can be talked about. Although they are talking about many different rare diseases, as I showed with the gene therapies. Well, not all of them affect neurodevelopment, although the vast majority do. So one of the things that NCATS funds for the last maybe 25 years now is called the Rare Disease Clinical Trials Network. And what that is they're asking for grants for several genetic conditions for exactly the reason we've been talking about, is that we learn much better when we study several together. That they're trying to get to conditions that have some biologic pathway that's similar, that can make sense in terms of potential biomarkers or treatment development, and study them together, study them longitudinally, and also study them across the country with multi-sites. And so it is within this effort that we got the natural history study funded. And so that's part of the Developmental Synaptopathies Consortium, and that's now been funded. We're almost, I think, at year 10, so we've been with different phases. So some of you may have been in the study before and not in it now, and others have joined more recently. And we are gearing up to try to get this for longer. And I'm just going to show you literally one slide, which I think encapsulates a lot of what we found. And this is just from the very beginning when we did our first several years and looked at recruitment of Phelan-McDermid syndrome, tuberous sclerosis, and P10. And so these are the 3 different genetic conditions that all have effects relating to the synapse, meaning neurodevelopmental effects is really the bottom line. And we tried to use the same measures across these conditions, and then over time, and as I've already alluded to, we've had to pivot because the whole point is that you don't know the natural history of the condition. We also didn't know how broad the heterogeneous the condition was. We also didn't know that exome sequencing would bring us, a much greater proportion of variants coming down the pike, and that would change things as well. But so this was from the beginning when actually there was a pretty small proportion of variants here. And as you can see, we tried to use the same measures for IQ or cognitive functioning, and it didn't work because different conditions require different, partly based on age, but partly based on developmental functioning. And as you can see here, we were able to, ascertain that a majority of the population with Phelan-McDermid syndrome was in the profound or severe ID range, whereas it was, TSC was much more heterogeneous and was a little maybe bimodal with its IQ, and P10 had very little severe or profound intellectual disability. And this is critical because this, reflects minimally verbal status, it reflects motor status, and it reflects ability to then complete other tests, right? Based on, ID is just one coarse way of summarizing impairments that really do affect a lot of the other measures that we use. You do not need to, and I don't want us to look at the details of this, but it just shows you that these were the measures we tried to give and that we just weren't able to give in Phelan-McDermid syndrome, which led to us changing, pivoting, looking for what other measures other people were using in other groups that had more severe or profound ID. Had we done this with some other conditions, maybe Pitt-Hopkins, Angelman's, Rett syndrome, we might have had different success in terms of at least being able to use the same measures. And it's actually good that we chose different conditions that had different levels of functioning because it led us to these really difficult questions of what do we do when there's such variability. I'm going to pivot here and now just focus a little bit on agenda because working on this measurement dilemma is one of the reasons that it was started. But just thinking about cooperation, actually working together, was a huge one. Certainly the collaborations that I'm talking about, Audrey, but many other studies that are collaborating, especially on these measures, and just making sure that we all communicate and definitely coordinate for these efforts that I'm talking about was the impetus and sort of the mission of this alliance. And we call it alliance because it's really a group of conditions that are getting together on a regular basis, and they can bring forward whatever issues they want to talk about. And some of them are very, very research focused, and we've involved the FDA in the meetings and some of the organizations I'm going to talk about. Some of them are much more practical and clinically focused. And so I just wanted to make sure that we got this across, and these are just a few of the conditions. There are, I don't know, Alicia can shout out how many, but many that are involved now with their foundations. There are family resources, there are scientific resources. We did a whole review of registries a while ago, and we're going to do a lot more. And I just put an example, and this was a few years ago, but a lot of these webinars are on their website, things that are just cross-cutting across neurodevelopmental conditions. These are just a few of them. I know some of these talks have happened here, but I think the talks are a little different sometimes when they have, multiple conditions and audience members attending. So this is all, everything is free and available, and the foundation is already heavily involved, and we hope that this continues to grow and can be a vehicle for a lot of the cross-disorder work that I'm talking about. So some of the things that we've done through Agenda are to talk about these other efforts, which I'm going to just highlight and then go on to some specific examples in a minute. So I mentioned the FDA patient-focused drug development. Now, the FDA is our sister HHS agency. They're not terribly patient family friendly. As a matter of fact, they're not really friendly to anybody, because I've spent so many hours trying to go through their website and figure things out. So that's part of what I hope that Agenda can do and we can do, is create more cheat sheets, roadmaps, things that can help us. But I did want to put in this public law that was 2016, which was called the Century Cures Act, that led to this patient-focused drug development process. I'm going to show in a minute that the Phelan-McDermid syndrome was one of the first to jump on this effort and utilize it, and I'll show how in a minute. But it's really the vehicle that, if you ever feel as a parent, caregiver, you're not involved, go to this, because this is going to tell you that you've got to be. And we're still figuring out, and they're still figuring out exactly how this works in every phase of the process, but it's being worked on. Another effort that's related is the idea of having core outcome measures or a core outcome set, measures that should be used across all studies. Right now, the drug companies that are here, I mean, they've literally been talking to each other the whole meeting, and there's so much collaboration happening. But as things develop and more drug companies are involved, more treatment trials are involved, it will be important for the foundation and for the group to think about that the same, maybe not measures, but the same outcomes should be considered across, because how are you going to know how one drug works versus another unless you're measuring the same things across? But to do that, you really need to know, again, what those concepts of interest are. What are the outcomes for this condition? This is a chicken and the egg issue, because we're still, the identification is still growing. We're still looking at how heterogeneous it is and what it is, and that's why the natural history is so important. But we need to do this in an iterative way. And then the FDA realized it couldn't do all this on their own, so they funded something called the Critical Path Institute, which is really focused on exactly this pathways, specifically with outcome measures. And they've developed something called the Rare Disease Clinical Outcome Assessment Resource. You just know that it's there, and that hopefully it's being utilized. It is being utilized across these conditions to develop listings of measures that have been vetted or validated in these populations. So these are the guidance documents that the FDA put out for the patient-focused drug development series. And again, the idea is enhancing the incorporation of the patient's voice, patient or caregiver, I would say, in the whole process, in the decision-making. Apparently, guidance 1 and 2 are the most patient caregiver friendly, and then 3 and 4 get even way more technical, more for the statisticians about how to really work on these endpoints. But if you want to start with 1 and 2, they're there. And then what they said was a key piece of the process is having these patient-focused drug development meetings, meeting with the FDA, using the same set of questions to ask what are the concepts of interest, what are the most important outcomes, and how we get to it. And they were really smart in using the same questions across the conditions, which is really helpful to us, because then we can think about it. So this is my own little search of related neurodevelopmental conditions, where they just started this in 2017, and since then these have all already occurred, and I think the requests are coming in fast, so it's great that Phelan-McDermid got in soon to do this. And some of you may have participated and been part of it. And so these are some of the questions, and this is now published. It's published on the FDA website. It's published in a paper, which I think I have on one of these slides. And so you can see it's literally the same question for every condition. So one of the main questions is, which of the following health concerns has the person with Phelan-McDermid syndrome? The one on the right is cerebral creatine deficiency syndromes had. And I put this together because you can see the terms may not be the exact same, but the ideas are the same. Developmental delay, speech delay, intellectual disability, fine motor, GI, gross motor, they're all up there on the top concerns. And I, in my free time, I'm trying to get somebody to do a project where we do this for all those conditions that I just showed you, because I think we're going to see unbelievable consensus in what these top issues are. And that is going to be used as a tool, I hope, to get more funding, get more efforts for the outcome measure development in them. And then another really, really important question that is asked, and this gets at this idea of what's a clinically meaningful change. And if you don't remember any term from this talk, remember that one, because that's the one that the stakeholders are going to have to decide what is a clinically meaningful change in every single trial, also just in any treatment that you do, in physical therapy you're doing, in school, but certainly for these trials. The FDA wants to know what is clinically meaningful. And I know I've had some deep conversations with some families about this at this meeting, because it is not an easy question to answer. A clinically meaningful change in a few weeks, in a few months, in a few years, what would be meaningful? So this is not exactly, this is getting at that. And as you can see, this is from the Phelan-McDermid paper. This is from the work. It was 114 families who asked this. You know, this may change over time, but this is just really important. It's important for me because I do work on the top two of those, cognition and communication, so it means that we've got our work cut out for us. We are also, the slowing or stopping disease progression, I think, relates to the regression work that's and the psychiatric symptoms is critical, and we've been talking about that 5 minutes. Okay, so, and it gets back to the problem that I showed you that we learned about from our natural history data, which is that 75% of the people with Phelan-McDermid syndrome in our study couldn't get an IQ test that was intended for their age range. This is not news to anybody here, but if we're going to use cognition as an outcome, we've got to figure out what we're doing. So we are so lucky that a group that focuses on developmental epilepsies has come together, because they are, know the importance of this, and this is their agenda for actually working on some new measures, or at least figuring out what works. And they have just forged ahead, by the way, with very little funding on their own, to do a survey. I know some of you have filled it out. Unbelievably, Shank3 and Phelan-McDermid syndrome was a huge respondents to the survey. These are the diagnoses. So across all these conditions that you see here, seizures, autism, global developmental delay, cortical vision impairment was less endorsed in Phelan-McDermid syndrome, but endorsed a little bit. And then you can see here that, again, the same message, that so this is a whole bunch of different areas, and communication was seen as a top priority. So one of the things they're doing is working with a group that already developed a measure that was focused on Angelman syndrome and then Rett syndrome, and exactly like I was telling you, that condition is more similar to Phelan-McDermid in ways of cognition and communication. So thank goodness we didn't have to develop this from start, that it was being worked on. And you all know, because you've all filled out those measures, and I am guilty, measures that assume the kid talks, doesn't consider AAC, doesn't think about the gestures used and all that stuff. This measure was developed exactly for that reason. So I highlighted it includes unique ways of communicating, so including AAC, gestures, and even what we would call nonverbal communication. So this is just showing you that it's so helpful to see how Phelan-McDermid fit in, and in this initial grouping, and this was qualitative work that was done, showed that it really, there was a lot of heterogeneity, and that's good. That means that we're going to see variability, and it will be helpful to see change. They're still working on the measure, but it just tells you that the work is underway. I just want to highlight another area, which is also talked about with parents a lot at this meeting, is that quality of life itself for the child and family. That can be an outcome in these trials, and it certainly is an outcome in a lot of other disease areas like cancer and things like that. The problem is that the quality of life measures that I used to see, would be like, can this person go to parties? Can the person, are they able to, move on in their homework and things like that? things, items that were not very relevant for the population we were at the starting point. So another measure, thank goodness, this one was developed a lot further away in Australia by someone working in Down syndrome and Rett syndrome, also focused on this population. And Jenny Downs is the developer of this, and she did tremendous work with qualitative work, working with families, getting their ideas about what the most important concepts within quality of life are, and this is what was seen to be. And then I just wanted to show this process of what it takes to develop a measure like this. Literature review, getting prior knowledge, but getting those consumer perspectives, then validating the content of it by getting a conceptual model, doing what we call cognitive debriefing, or asking questions to parents, to ask the questions aloud. Do they make sense to you? And then to refine based on that, and then to keep doing this. So it's not a little bit of work to develop these measures. I'm going to talk about one more collaboration, which is the group that's Combined Brain, that is doing an incredible job of working on these disease concepts. So again, you need to have a lot of natural history data, you need to have this qualitative work of what's most important, and then you can get at this disease concept, which the FDA likes. Again, it can change, and you're not going to focus necessarily on all of it, but it also includes how does having this disease fit into the real world evidence. What does it mean for school, for jobs, for economic outcomes, everything? And again, it includes this really hard work of open-ended questions to families and interviews. And so this is just a paper that went through this process, got expert clinicians' perspectives and researchers, but really focused a lot on the caregiver perspective to get this conceptual model. And you can all look at it and see that I think it might not be the exact same as Phelan-McDermid, but there's a lot that's similar. And then now they're working on a conceptual model for all these other conditions, and Phelan-McDermid is among them. I'm just going to briefly talk about RareX because registry data, in addition to the work of this foundation, is going on cross disorder, and I'm just going to show you that RareX is an organization that is trying to do a lot of other cross disorders for those conditions, especially that didn't have a registry already, I should say. Phelan-McDermid was ahead of the game in getting the registry going, but this has been much more for conditions that didn't have it. And the idea, again, is using the same questions across. And when they did that, they found, again, same things. Same kinds of neurodevelopmental issues, and this is across a whole bunch of different conditions, are the top concerns. So it's just comforting to me to see, I've now shown in many, many different venues in many different ways that issues that seem to be important and that we're seeing in the natural history data are very significant for Phelan-McDermid syndrome are cross, which just validates our idea of doing these cross disorder efforts. Another effort, I did not want to leave out Europe at all, that's a really helpful registry effort going on there, is Genida, and it really has the same idea. And I think I do worry sometimes that we are doing slightly different things in different places, and that's why I'm trying to keep abreast of all of these different ones. And then another effort that has a lot more genotype, phenotype data to it is this one that I found, which just I wanted to put out there that may be helpful to some. And I think that is it for me. And this is from the foundation from a long time ago that I had to put on here because I just love it. But then I wanted to put other kids with other conditions because that's the idea, is that we're trying to help them all. So I want to thank the families, the collaborators, people who have helped me get this knowledge and acknowledge NIH. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Dr. Thurm, for very elegantly explaining something that I think is really complex and has been a gap for us and for me as a foundation is why are these surveys, these repeated surveys, which can be frustrating, so important? I mean, you've all heard from us about the Inchstone Project, the externally led patient-focused drug development meeting. You've heard about the ORCA from us, but this is why this is so important, and to be able to measure improvement in trials and to see such dedicated people like Dr. Thurm doing that, I think is really inspiring. So you know the drill with questions, scan the QR code and or upvote other questions. I think probably a big one is going to be how to get involved, but I'll start with some of the ones on the screen. One of the questions, some of our folks have participated in the Inchstone Project or the DEE Parents Speak. What are the next steps? So once they fill out those surveys, are they going to engage with the FDA? How does that work?
Yeah, I think they already are. Somebody just got a grant to actually start developing a cognitive measure that is not the Bailey or the Mullen, something different, looking at the concept of responsivity. And so this population may get involved in piloting that measure. There's further work developed. Again, as I mentioned, the ORCA was developed for Angelman, and that's sort of the normative scores now. We need to get scores for the Phelan-McDermid population, see if it needs to be different or not. And so again, be prepared for more questions for that. And then the idea is to continue. I mean, they're working within some of the main developmental epilepsy conditions that they're working on, that they're testing a lot of this by trying to put forward these measures in studies that are ongoing. But I just think having the foundation continue to be involved with Inchstone along the way is going to be helpful. But the idea is, like I said, to modify existing measures and then create these new measures as needed.
And some of the time it is to get a baseline too. So if you see the same thing again, it's because it's being improved. So the ORCA, for instance, is used in clinical trials now, but they are improving it across a lot of disorders. So that's why you're seeing things again.
Can I just make a point to that? So I mean, again, when there literally was nothing, the FDA was willing to approve measures, just as they're willing to sometimes veer in sample size and how long a trial is, in control arms in these measures for conditions that are so rare that we've got the treatment, we've got to move ahead. In a way, these treatments are going faster than our outcome measures are, so they're relying on it. But that doesn't mean, just because the FDA is letting that trial go on, doesn't mean that they're going to get approval for the drug with those. That's a whole other step, and that's why we need to continue to work on these measures. I just want to make that clear.
We have an upvoted question that is educating me because I didn't know this existed, but it says FDA just announced the development of a rare disease innovation hub. Do you know about that? Is that a further development in the process you described? Will it help to speed therapy development?
I know about this because I heard a talk from an FDA person yesterday. This just came out this week. I have not looked at it extensively. I think it's probably more for researchers, is what I'm guessing.
But hopefully it will speed therapy development. Next one is a huge one, which is kind of the central focus of this talk. Do the researchers who work on Fragile X, Rett, Prader-Willi, Williams syndrome, et cetera, have forums to talk? Is there an easy way to talk?
I love this person. Yes and no, not enough. They have Liz Berry-Crevice. That's who they have, because she does all of it. Seriously, she herself is the hub for a lot of this because she's doing so much work in so many conditions, and several of us are, but some people are just focused on one condition, and that is a huge problem. So thank you for that. There isn't exactly a meeting or space for this yet.
I just was talking with Dr. Berry-Crevice when she first came here, and she is going to back-to-back 5 or 6 conferences right now for the separate disorders she works with, and that's not uncommon for a lot of these folks to be working across disorders, and so they've done a beautiful job themselves of inspiring collaboration, but as Dr. Thurm says, it's hard. There's not always official forums for it.
Yeah, this is the fourth summer talk I'm giving that's in this realm for exactly this reason. It needs to get across. And like I said, there's different forms. I mean, there's Society for Neuroscience for all the basic work that exists, and then there's meetings for autism and intellectual disability that has a lot of the behavioral work, but not exactly this for rare disease. With neurodevelopment, yeah.
This next person says, I know this is unrelated. I don't think it's entirely unrelated, but we'll try to make it more general. How do we find qualified physicians to support our children's medical care? Maybe someone who specializes in some of these that are less rare, have lessons that can be applied. Yeah. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, no, that's really, really great. And it is true that there are hubs, and they happen to be the places that are also doing the natural history work, that also have clinics. So I would definitely start there. There are not that many, but it is true actually that the hubs for Angelman's and Rett syndrome work may be the next place to look for physicians, certainly geneticists and neurologists that are focused on these conditions. And that's actually something Agenda can do, is try to get a map of all the different natural history studies where many of those physicians and clinicians are also doing clinical work with those conditions.
That's a great point. As an example, I live in Philadelphia, which is the home of CHOP, the Children's Hospital, and they are they obviously have a ton of expertise in genetic neurodevelopmental disorders, but not necessarily specifically Phelan-McDermid. They are known to be kind of a center of excellence for a lot of other disorders, so it's kind of maybe a next phase to engage them more specifically in Phelan-McDermid. But if there's a center near you that specializes in Rett or anything else like that, it's probably a good bet. This is a big one. We could probably talk about this for an hour, but what are the ways we would want the FDA to change their processes or protocols to best support development of products for diseases which affect development?
Yeah. Show them my slide, or just go like this with your hands, or just explain to them that development is different and that these measures need to be different. The outcomes need to be different. The metric needs to be different. We are, and I decided I wasn't getting into the weeds in this talk, but we are having a heck of a time convincing them not to use standard scores. You all know what the standard scores are: the mean of 100, the standard deviation of 15. Your kid might be a 30 or a 20 or a 40. And by the way, we can't get standard scores for most of our kids. That's what I was talking about. So there's this other metric called growth scale values, which are basically like a growth chart that exist in a lot of the measures, but they weren't used early on in other studies. And we're trying to get them to use this, and we're having to explain it over and over and over again. And that's why these conditions have to work together, is because they need to use the same language and say the same things.
And this doesn't have to be a comprehensive answer because it's a lot on the spot, but I'll ask one last question because we are at time. But what disorders could you list off that you would think could be closely related to Phelan-McDermid? I know I hear or see a lot about SYNGAP1 related intellectual disability in the literature, and we've mentioned a few of them, but what else?
That's not, I'm not going to answer that the way they want. And partly because Phelan-McDermid syndrome is so heterogeneous itself. So it depends who you are and what stage you're at, right? So I'm not going to answer that. But I might publish papers on that, so look at that. And I think it depends on the domain. And I just mean we need to think about the metrics that we're using. I'm not saying that I wouldn't talk about it. Like I said, it depends on the age. I think communication is a huge way to think about it, because it is the outcome that we're looking at. So I think looking at similar communication levels, and we don't need fancy tests to do that. We can talk about who's got words or doesn't have words, who's able to use AAC and who isn't. I think we can think about that. So I think people have the answer to that if they look at these sort of domains.
And I actually am going to ask you one more just because we're still here. So do you know if any of the subjects in the natural history study had both TSC and Phelan-McDermid? My guess would be no, but that you can still learn across disorders.
Had both conditions? I am not aware of that, but there are some patients with all of the conditions that do have second conditions, but I'm not aware of that exact combination.
Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Dr. Thurm for a fantastic talk. And we chose this as our last care and cure session, not because it's the least important. In many ways, it's the most important because these are the next steps, is to continue to engage these other groups. So thank you, Dr. Thurm.